Dr. Thomas Lovejoy is professor at George Mason University. He's senior fellow at the United Nations Foundation. He's a former president of the Heinz Center for Science, Economics, and Environment. He's co-founder of the public television series Nature. If you're like me, you'll love that series. Former senior advisor to the president of the United Nations Foundation. He served as the chief biodiversity advisor for Latin America region for the World Bank. In the 70s, he helped bring attention to the issue of tropical deforestation. In 1980, he was the first to talk about the estimate of global extinction of species. He served as an advisor on the Reagan, the George H.W. Bush, and the Clinton administrations. He's been called the godfather of biodiversity. And today I asked him at lunch, I said, well, gee, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of our planet? And he looked at me with a stern face and said, I'm optimistic. We have no choice. So with that, please welcome Dr. Thomas Lovejoy.
So thank you so much for that great introduction. Thank you all for being here tonight. And in particular, this reminds me of how special a person Jessica Catto was. So I'm dedicating tonight's talk to Jessica and her memory. So if we could have the first slide, please. I want to run through quite rapidly 500 years of exploration and science in the Amazon. We've been looking previously at the National Geographic map of the Amazon, which is intended to show all the good and all the bad, sort of the template on which the future of the Amazon can be planned. But let's go back to 1541. In February of 1541, the half-brother of the great conquistador Pizarro, Gonzalo Pizarro, was in charge of Quito in that region of the Viceroyalty. And he, with his second in command, Francisco de Orellana, set out on an expedition to go down to the Amazon in search of cinnamon and gold. Francisco de Orellana was not even 30. He was born in 1511 in the little town of Trujillo in the Extremadura of Spain, where all the conquistadors came from, a really hard scrabble world, which probably explains why they were such tough cookies. And they set off with 220 soldiers, 4,000 native porters, 2,000 pigs, and I don't know how many hundreds of horses. And so they went up over the Andes and down into the Amazon basin. And just before Christmas, 1541, they'd already lost 140 soldiers. All the indigenous, probably enslaved porters were gone. All the pigs were gone. And there was a little conference going on. What are we going to do? And Orellana and Gonzalo Pizarro decided that Orellana would go ahead with 49 men and decide whether there was any point in continuing this so far very unfortunate expedition. And what happened was that every time they reached a new river, it was bigger than the one before. And they finally got to the Rio Napo, and Orellana's men revolted, He resigned his commission, which is a really, really important point, because otherwise he would be considered a traitor. And then the men re-elected him as their leader, and they continued downstream thousands of miles. And they entered a world of just incredible biological diversity, and a world filled with very large settlements of Amazonian indigenous people. And the chronicler of the expedition, named Gaspar de Carvajal, who actually took an arrow through the eye but survived, chronicled all of this, and because he thought that they saw Amazon women when they were about halfway down the Amazon, the whole report was discredited and was never published until 1895. But the modern understanding that there are actually large populations, they were never out of sight of indigenous villages in the entire trip, actually now today is given great credit. So it is hard to find remnants of that high civilization of Amazonian Indians, except in remote places like in the northwestern Amazon in Colombia. So fast forward another couple centuries. The good news is that Oriana and his crew, all 49 of them, made it to the mouth of the Amazon. They didn't lose a single person. And it was just an extraordinary trip. And you can read about it in a wonderful modern account called The River of Darkness. So 200 years later, there is in Europe a huge controversy going on in science about what is the shape of the Earth. Is it squeezed a little bit this way, or is it squeezed a little bit this way? The French scientists thought it was squeezed a little bit this way. Newton thought it was this way. And the only way to solve this big controversy was to actually send an expedition to the equator, which meant South America because Africa really wasn't accessible then, and measure an arc of latitude. And so a major expedition led by Charles-Marie de Condamine went off to the New World and basically to Ecuador, to Quito, in 1735. And they spent 9 years actually taking the measurements and returning, and proved Newton was right, which wouldn't surprise us, as we think about Newton today. But one of the members of that expedition was not just the grand leader, Charles-Marie de la Condamine, it was Jean Gaudin, a young man who fell in love with a conquistador's daughter, married, and decided to stay behind. And he tried to make a living in that part of the world, was not very good at it, and finally he and his wife decided that they would go back to France. And he said, well, I will go ahead and chart the journey down the Amazon, the same trip that Oriana had made, and then come back and get you. And so he headed down the river, got down successfully, got to Cayenne in what is French Guiana today. And then the Spanish and the Portuguese would not allow him to return. And so, in fact, he was separated from his wife for an extraordinarily long period of time, something like 9 years. And then she decided she would go and meet him in Cayenne. So she gets on a boat with all her china and all her dresses and all the things that really wouldn't help you going down the Amazon. And about 20% of the way down the river, she is the only survivor. And that is her, Isabelle Gramacon Godin. And she wanders around in the forest for 9 days, semi-delirious, all by herself. Is found and rescued and actually makes it all the way to Cayenne. Is reunited with her husband, and they go back to France and live happily ever after. So after that, the Amazon sort of became a place which was not used for much, not used much for science. It was a place of natural resources, a place that produced Brazil nuts. This is a Brazil nut fruit in the lower left there. The Brazil nuts that we get to eat are just one of several elements in that fruit. And every Brazil nut you have ever eaten came out of the Amazon forest, because it has only one pollinator, and that pollinator needs a lot of other tree species to support it during those months of the year when the Brazil nut is not in flower. And of course, it was also the source of rubber. And once Charles Goodyear had made his little experiment, which included a mistake of dropping some of it on the kitchen stove, and stinking up the house, which his wife would not have liked. But it was what basically made it possible to turn rubber into automobile tires and bicycle tires. Suddenly the Amazon was a center of economic importance in the world. And all the rubber that began to spread through Europe and the industrialized world came out of the Amazon. And there were vast fortunes made. And this is the city of Manaus, which was 1,000 miles up the river. The people in Manaus had the first electric streetlights in entire South America. They could bring any famous star to their opera house that they wanted. And they lived very well for a few decades. Basically, there was nothing they couldn't have because they had so much money. Until in about the 1890s, Henry Wickham, who had spent a life obsessed with making a fortune in a tropical commodity, and was finally sort of focusing in on rubber, figured out that the first steamship was coming up the Amazon, and maybe somebody hadn't figured out what it would carry on the way out, and that indeed was the case. It was the perfect time of year to harvest rubber tree seeds. He sent teams of people out into the forest, and that ship went legally, which nobody in Brazil believes, but legally from the Amazon to Britain, went to Liverpool. They had a special train that took the seeds down to the Kew Gardens, and 3% of the seeds germinated. And that became the entire basis for the Southeast Asian rubber industry until about 30 years ago, when some new genetic stock was brought in. But because they could grow it in plantation form, it totally undercut wild rubber harvested out of the forest. So the lights went out in Manaus, and if you ask anybody in Brazil today, they will tell you that the rubber trees were actually smuggled out. It's not actually the truth, but that's the popular understanding. Just at that same time, in Sweden, the scientist Arrhenius was trying to understand why the Earth is a habitable temperature for humans and other forms of life. Why isn't it too cold? And the reason was the greenhouse effect and levels of CO2 in the atmosphere trapping radiant heat. And incidentally, he calculated on pencil and paper, what doubling pre-industrial levels of CO2 would do to the Earth's temperature, and it's exactly where the big fancy computer models put it today. What Arrhenius did not know, and we'll return to this story later in the talk, was the actual history of the climate of the Earth over the previous hundreds of thousands of years, and in particular, that the last 10,000 years had been a period of unusual climatic stability. So that's the origins of agriculture, the origin of human settlements. Basically, the entire human enterprise is based on the assumption of a stable climate. But back in the Amazon, this biological treasure trove began to attract some really great naturalists. It became a place to do science. And one of these was Henry Walter Bates, who wrote A Naturalist on the River Amazons. Here he's just caught a small toucan, and he's essentially being attacked almost by the other toucans in the flock. I've actually had that same experience happen to me when I caught one in a net and banded it, and then all the others came down out of big curiosity. And another was Alfred Russel Wallace, whose entire collections he saw burn and sink as he was headed back to Europe, which then led him to go to Southeast Asia as the next place of biological collecting opportunity, where he both independently thought of the principle of natural selection and of the science of animal geography. And the third, far less well-known, Richard Spruce, who did extraordinary botanical exploration. And it's fascinating that there is now a book about those three. They all knew each other. They were all contemporaries. And they all made huge contributions. So now we're in the 20th century, and the next great expedition is led by Theodore Roosevelt, newly out of office, craving adventure, and he sets off with his Brazilian partner, Colonel Rondon, who laid out the telegraph lines of Brazil, down 1,000 miles of unexplored river. It was where he had a really bad accident, which probably led to his life being shorter than it otherwise might be. But a wonderful example of Brazilian-American collaboration. The Brazilians love this to this day. And then further into the 20th century, about the time that I'm arriving, science is still the main preoccupation. And so when I arrived, there was a tower that was built up into the forest near Belém. And you could get up and see what was happening in the upper parts of this forest, which was very different from what happened down below. And I actually was able to lure the world's most famous birdwatcher, Roger Tory Peterson, to come down and spend a couple weeks. And when Roger found there was a tower, nothing would do except every morning he had to be up there at 5:30 to see what was going on in the canopy. So this is Roger 30 meters above the rainforest floor is viewed from 35 meters in a view I never tire of calling a bird's eye view of Roger Tory Peterson. One of the other really interesting stories involving the canopy of the rainforest involved the jungle cycle of yellow fever, which involved a very different mosquito than the one involved in the urban cycle, which happens to be the same one running the Zika virus. And everybody knew that there was a cycle in the canopy of the forest that attacked howler monkeys, but nobody could figure out why occasionally people would walk out of the forest with a case of yellow fever, because they were walking around like 100 feet below where all this other was going on. And a good friend of mine, Jorge Boschel, a Colombian, was the one who cracked that secret. And he was out watching woodcutters in Colombia take down trees in the forest, and suddenly they were surrounded by little blue mosquitoes, the ones that transmitted yellow fever in the canopy. So in many ways, the ultimate metaphor of unfortunate consequences from disturbing the environment. Other interesting research looked at the river system, and I didn't mention earlier, but the Amazon is as big as the 48 states. It is a huge area. It doesn't look so large on maps in the Cartesian projection because anything towards the poles is magnified. So it's as big as the 48 states. It includes about 20% of the world's river water, about 3,000 species of fish. And one of the great puzzles about fish in the Amazon drainage is why it's so productive. So you have white water filled with sediments carved off the Andes, here meeting the black waters of the Rio Negro, without those sediments, filled with tannins. And if you look at the water chemistry, you can't explain why they support such really sort of productive fisheries. And the answer that behind these fisheries, which provides maybe half the animal protein that people eat in the Amazon, is that during the high water months of the year when the river actually rises 15, 20, sometimes 30 meters, it rains that much, then not only can fishermen canoe into the forest, but fish can swim into the forest. And there they feed on fruits and seeds and other organic matter that falls in the water. So you have an enormous nutrient input coming from the terrestrial ecosystem into the aquatic one. And that's basically what explains that productivity. So piranhas go vegetarian at that time of year. In the Rio Negro, the most abundant fish species has sandpaper lips, and it scrapes the lichens off the tree trunks. And there are others that eat hard palm nuts. It's an extraordinary bit of biology, but it's all about an enormous nutrient transfer into the aquatic system. Other research involved what actually produces the rain in the Amazon. And until the 1970s, the global dogma was that vegetation is simply the consequence of climate. It has no effect on climate. And a good friend of mine actually was the one in the 70s who did the research that disproved that, and some of it looked at what happens when rain does actually fall on the forest. Well, like only about a quarter of it actually goes into the river system, and the rest gets transpired into the air mass moving westward towards the Andes or evaporated off the complex surfaces of the trees. And so that is Aeneas Salati who did that work. He just shattered that dogma, looking at isotope ratios of oxygen and rainwater from the Atlantic to Peru, which is a very important part of why we need to worry about how the Amazon is managed. And earliest computer models, what would happen if you cut down the entire Amazon? Temperature would go up, the rainfall would go down. It's much more obviously complicated than that, but those are the general principles. And the indigenous populations, which had been basically decimated by Western diseases shortly after colonization and largely overlooked, were viewed in a way that is expressed by this World War II aviators map, which divides the tribes of the Amazon into two: hostile and unfriendly. And then began the era of major transformation, major development. And it began with a pretty well-designed but miserably executed World Bank project around a road in the western Amazon in Rondonia. And you can see the amount of deforestation between 1982 and 1985. And another thing that we were becoming aware of at the time was that, as deforestation or habitat destruction proceeds, habitat fragmentation is always sort of the handmaiden. So here we're looking at Atlantic forests in coastal Brazil, not in the Amazon. And we're looking at 1945, I can't even read it, 1960 something, and another couple decades. And what you see is not only massive deforestation, but only fragments are left. And habitat fragmentation was not considered to be a serious conservation issue. And it was only some theoretical work in biology that began to raise questions about that that led people like me to begin to think, we really ought to figure out what habitat fragmentation actually does. And so I was actually able to not only have a wild idea, but actually be able to pull it off and have a giant experiment in the middle of the Amazon in which fragments of forest were set aside in the course of development. So no forest was cut down that wasn't going to be cut down anyway, but the pattern was done in a way that we could actually study this process. So those are some of the first fragments set aside in the central Amazon. And to just give you an extent of just how negative the effects of habitat fragmentation are, 100-hectare fragment of forest, which is 250 acres, sounds sort of substantial. The birds of the forest interior, like this white-plumed antbird, birds which don't like to go out in the sunlight, 100-hectare fragment loses half of those species in less than 15 years. And because when fragmentation occurs, you don't see all those implications, immediately up front. People had never taken fragmentation as seriously as it should be. So here's one of those fragments shown, very vulnerable to wind throw. This basically shows that in some instances you lose up to 35% of just the standing biological mass in those fragments. And I won't go on any more about that particular study, but to go on to say that some of the current research in the Amazon is trying to look at the larger pictures of how the system works, how it's responding to climate change, how it cycles carbon, how it cycles water, and how the things being done to the forest are affecting those. So by 1987, the invasion of the Amazon by development was really strong. So this is one day with 2,500 fires in Rondonia. And I remember actually flying during the period shown here in 1997, an El Nino year, a very dry year, when there was so much smoke over the Amazon, it was as big as, the cloud was as big as Brazil. And a lot of this had to do with building roads, and this is a logical construct in some senses. Well, you need to get somewhere, you build a road. And the fact that the road might lead to other things doesn't seem to be in anybody's mind when those decisions are made. So this is what Highway and road expansion looked like in Brazilian Amazonia maybe 10 years ago. And one of the analyses one of my colleagues did just shows, the closer you are to a road, the more fires there are. And we're also dealing with highways being built across the Amazon to the Pacific. We're dealing with illegal gold mining, with huge sort of hydraulic systems ripping up the aquatic systems. It's a particular problem in Amazonia and Peru at the moment. Major sort of planned highway systems without really thinking about the consequences. And so the time has come to think differently about all this, think in a more integrated kind of way, so that we might end up with something more like on the left than on the right. Major oil and gas extraction, all kinds of hydroelectric plants planned, particularly in western Amazonia, in Peru. Here's one of them. And even the thought of a major transmission line, a direct current high voltage transmission line from the western Amazon down to industrial southern Brazil. So one of the things we need to worry about in all of this relates to what Aeneas Salati discovered about how Brazil makes half of its own rainfall. And here you can see how most of the rainfall in the world is generated over the oceans and at the equator, with the Amazon being a major exception, as Salati had already proved. It makes half of its own rainfall. So when we have this amount of deforestation, the question is, will that begin to undercut that hydrological cycle? And there are suggestions that in fact that may be the case, because we've had unprecedented droughts in 2005 and 2010. And I think the tipping point in all of this, which could lead to Amazon dieback, is around 20% deforestation, which is what it is at the moment. The Brazilian government actually recognizes that as serious and is planning reforestation to build back a margin of safety. So all of this leads us back, of course, to the big global question of climate change. How much is too much? Happily, at the Paris conference, we began to talk again about 1.5 degrees as opposed to 2 degrees. And it's not just about ice, it's also about what it will do to living systems. The good news in all of this is that, unbeknownst to most people, of the excess CO2 in the atmosphere, a significant amount, in addition to that, from fossil fuels, comes from centuries of deforestation and degradation and destruction of ecosystems. So if one flips that around and thinks about restoring those ecosystems, we can actually pull a lot of that CO2 back from the atmosphere. So this is the annual equation of what goes on. A lot of CO2 being emitted by burning of old ecosystem, which is what fossil fuels are, and still a significant amount from destruction of modern day ecosystems, and literally deforestation is 30% of annual emissions. It's bigger than the entire transportation sector. And every year, about half remains in the atmosphere, leading to climate change, and half goes into the land and half goes into the ocean. So the question is, if we got really proactive about how we manage the land and restoring ecosystems, how can we change some of those numbers, maybe even change the direction of one of those arrows? And we know that twice in the history of life on Earth, the planet has actually dealt with high CO2 levels. through natural processes and brought it down to pre-industrial levels. So we know that nature can do it. But we just don't have tens of millions of years to let that happen. Happily, we're smart enough to be able to think about it as something that we could actually do, and that we could actually essentially re-green the emerald planet and reduce the amount of climate change we're going to have to cope with. So if you look at all of that, tropical forests are big numbers in all of this. And here's a calculation that Stuart Pym at Duke did about what happens just with tropical forests in South America, and just the really large number of gigatons of carbon that could be pulled out of the atmosphere annually by reforestation. So there is a lot of good news in all of this. Usually you only hear about the bad news, you hear about the roads, you hear about the fires. But when I first set foot in the Amazon, there was only one national park. By the year 2000, it looked like this: national parks in indigenous areas. By 2009, it looked like that. For the entire Amazon, around 2008 or 9, it looked like that. By 2012, it looked like that. So literally more than half of the Amazon is under some form of protection. And if 30 years ago somebody had suggested that would be possible, I assure you they would have been carted off to some local mental institution. And so it's some really extraordinary things have been done here. It's not enough for the reasons we've been talking about, but it is an extraordinary achievement. And one part of it that rarely gets talked about is, what is the role of cities in all of this? This is the city of Manaus, once the capital of the rubber boom, but today an economic free zone with about 2 million people, largest Harley-Davidson factory in the world, a major manufacturing location. And what it does is actually, the greater the economic activity in Manaus, the lower the deforestation rate in the state of Amazonas. People are drawn to the economic opportunity. So we need to really think creatively about the role of cities in solving this great challenge. And we also need to think about local communities. This is a local foundation for a sustainable state of Amazonas, a state 2.3 times the size of Texas. The scale of some of these things is quite impressive. And then there are the indigenous communities who are in charge of something like 27% of the Amazon, all demarcated in Brazil and mostly demarcated elsewhere. And they're quite capable of fast forwarding from the civilizations that they had for centuries into the modern age. And so a lot of efforts are being made to help them map their own territory. So here they're doing GPS work, actually figuring out what their lands are. And let me tell you, they defend them. They're better than any police force in the world. So let me end by just a couple examples of how the Amazon has touched all of us in ways that we probably are unaware of. So this is the front end of a big viper called the Bushmaster. And people rarely have cozy feelings about the Bushmaster. And any cozy feeling they might have had, they immediately lose when you explain that the venom of the snake causes whatever it bites to have its blood pressure to go to 0 forever. So, what does that have to do with anything? Well, scientists at Brazil's Butantan Institute in Sao Paulo actually tried to figure out, how does that venom work? And they discovered a system for regulation of blood pressure, previously unknown. It's called the angiotensin system. And chemists for the squid company, knowing that system existed, were able to build a molecule which plays on it. And that was the first of the ACE inhibitors, a medicine that has many different kinds now, but literally enables hundreds of millions of people around this planet to live longer, healthier, and more productive lives. That's the giant library function of biodiversity and of the Amazon. And it will continue to produce revelations about living systems that can benefit us directly. A less obvious story involves the giant Amazon water lily, which is named for Queen Victoria, actually before she got large. The underside of the water lily has this incredible sort of network and structure of essentially cellulose girders and cross connections. Spines are there to keep the manatees away. And the first person to get these to bloom in horticulture in Europe was named Joseph Paxton. He was head gardener for the Duke of Devonshire. And he was really intrigued by this structure. And he did one of those experiments that mothers don't like. And he thought it would probably support a lot of weight. So he got a copper lid and put it on one of these lily pads. And then he put their daughter on top of the lid. And it supported the combined weight of 60 pounds. And that led him in turn to think, well, wouldn't it be interesting to build a glass house for the Duke's water lilies using the structural principles directly from the underside of the giant water lily? And that he did. And that in turn became the basis for his design of the Crystal Palace of the Great London Exhibition of 1851, which is the origin of modern metal beam architecture. And as my wonderful professor Hutchinson said to me, half the buildings in the industrialized world derive from the underside of the giant water lily. So that's some of the extraordinary potential that actually exists in the biodiversity of the Amazon. We know, obviously, also that it's intimately connected with how our climatic system works and why it's so important to think globally about environment. Thank you very much. So I think there's time for some questions. Yes, sir.
Are there any countries that are actually planting more trees in the world today than there are cutting down trees? Do you know of any?
My guess is that Costa Rica has actually reached that mark.
There's also a Middle East country that
Israel. I would also expect that if Brazil really engages in its reforestation plan, it will actually meet that. So I think we're going to see. So let me just back up a minute. At the Paris Climate Conference, which was a really major achievement, and we all know it wasn't enough, but it was a major achievement. The role of forests became prominent in a way that had never become prominent before. And what you're talking about, restoration, began to be talked about all over the place. So suddenly I think we're talking about, 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 we're talking about actually understanding that our planet works as a linked biological and physical system, and that we have to manage it that way, and that instead of thinking as nature of little bits of isolated protected areas in human-dominated landscapes, we actually should be thinking about human aspiration embedded in nature. And the minute we start thinking that way, I think it will be revolutionary in terms of attitudes about the environment. And the other thing I mentioned to somebody earlier is, when you think about it that way, the whole climate change challenge goes from being something that's so big, what can I possibly do, to something that every individual can do something about. Just like with Victory Gardens in the Second World War. Yes?
Can you, over time, begin to replicate the biodiversity of primary forest through restoration?
So I think the question is can you actually do reforestation that becomes something close to primary forest? And I think the answer is yes, but so small clearings essentially heal themselves. They're not too much bigger than a normal sort of tree fall in a forest. Really big clearings become problematical. One, because their climate becomes drier and hotter, but also because the big forest giants mostly have big seeds. They start off their saplings with a food supply, and those don't disperse by wind, that's for sure. And basically they disperse by animal dispersers or a rodent or something. That's sort of like squirrels do, but multiplied up in size. So if you have a big deforested area, that's going to happen very, very slowly, just creeping in from the edges. And so I think if you want to make it faster, you need another mammal to help, like a big primate, right? Yes, sir.
How much more effective are the trees in the Amazon and other tropical rainforests as carbon sinks than trees of other species, other kinds of trees? Or are they?
Yeah, so I think the best way to answer that is if we can talk about sort of the lowest carbon denominator, the common denominator of a forest is carbon, which in a way is, like thinking of the value of a silicon chip as silicon. But if you think about it that way, tropical forests have greater concentrations of carbon, greater amounts of carbon per area than most forests in the world. Not sure what the number is for redwoods, for example, but in general, they're much more carbon dense per unit area. Yes?
What can we do to help in Aspen?
Help the
rainforest.
So what can you do to help the rainforest? There are a lot of things you can do to help the rainforest. Number one is make sure a lot of people know that it's important. Number two, figure out people and organizations who are trying to help the rainforest and figure out whether there are ways you can help them. Number three, I'd say go visit one and really understand what it's like. And then I think you'll never look back. So maybe you'll come to my camp in the Amazon sometime. Yes?
I'm wondering, building on the legacy of Theodore Roosevelt, today, are there
not only individuals, but corporations, NGOs, enterprises like pharmaceutical companies who are in the United States, who are actively working to, through partnerships in Brazil, to encourage the kind of reforestation and conservation that is so important.
So there are a lot of corporations, enlightened corporations, that are looking for ways to actually make a difference in all of this. And it might seem like a total contradiction in terms, but the Caterpillar Corporation, which we all know builds a lot of big machines, actually is really interested in how those machines can help in restoration. Held a major conference this past November around restoration. And so the big issue, when you make machines like that is what do they get used for? I mean, you can't control it entirely, but if it goes to reforestation, rebuilding the Mississippi Delta so that it works more like it used to, that is an extraordinary contribution. So I find, across the corporate world, a lot of enlightened leaders. Not enough, for sure, but a lot. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the value of
Tom, you mentioned the value of reforesting tropical forests in terms of carbon sequestration. Can you comment on any effort worldwide to look at shifting that human interest in producing beef to natural grassland ecosystems, and how well-managed grazing on natural grasslands can actually perhaps be a nice shift and create a carbon sink?
So there is actually really important work going on in all of that. And so the Woods Hole Research Center is starting on doing a global map of ecosystem restoration potential, and that's going to include grasslands. And the numbers that I saw a few years ago about the amount of carbon that could actually be recaptured from the atmosphere in Australia by restoring degraded grasslands was enormous. And the grasslands of the American Middle West had incredible amounts of carbon in the soil. The root systems went down like 12 feet. I mean, just extraordinary. So another part of what needs to be done here is not just grasslands for grazing, but also how do we manage agricultural ecosystems so they accumulate carbon instead of leaking it. And I had a really, really interesting experience about 3 years ago, late August. I'm in Peoria, Illinois. My taxi driver is a third-generation farmer, and he just tells me, we do no-till here. I thought, well, that's interesting. And then on the same trip, I learned that there is so much topsoil in the Illinois River that it became worth the local government spending $16 million to dredge that topsoil and sell it back to the farmers. So there, so much of this in the end is about really sensible things to do. It's one of the things that gives me a lot of hope. Yes?
How many people have died from the bush viper snake?
I don't know how many people have actually died from the bite of the Bushmaster, but I can tell you hundreds of millions of more have lived longer and healthier lives because of what we know about how its venom works. He really likes snakes.
One final question, please.
I just want to hear more about the canopies and the zones in a forest. How many, can you stratify how many biozones are in a forest like that? You know, looking at the tower, wondering how many times do you stop and look directly in to see something different?
So the question is about the vertical stratification in the forest, which I actually planned to do my PhD thesis on and then did something else. It's not entirely clear-cut, but it's pretty impressive because there are things that live only on top, like macaws, for example, or toucans. And there are things that only walk around on the forest floor. And there are things that only fly just under the canopy. I'm thinking birds, of course. And things that only are in mid-story, and things that are, between the mid-story and lower story, and those that fly low to the ground. And I'm sure that if you had really good information about the insect life, it would probably be even more finely divided. But in any particular place, it'll be a little fuzzy because a tree will have fallen and it will have changed some of the environmental conditions that those animals use to sort of determine their ideal location. But it's going into the forest, the first time you go in, it's boring. It's green, nothing, you don't see anything, That's because they're hiding from each other and they're hiding from you. And then you begin to notice that there are 1,000 different colors of green. And if you sit quiet, you begin to see some things. And then you realize how incredibly rich it is.
I think that's all the time we have. Round of applause for Dr. Lovejoy. Thank you.